So today we will be attacking the really big topic of ethics. So ethics as a whole we will never be able to cover. What I kind of want to do in this video is go down sort of the Wikipedia article, honestly, of ethics and try to drill down what ethics really is, how it is subdivided, and what you can expect ethics to be doing for you as a tool to use in business. So at the core, ethics is about figuring out what is right and wrong. However, it's not just that. It is trying to systematize this and putting it into perspective. A lot of people think philosophy is basically just thinking about stuff and figuring out what it means. That's not it. You can do that in any kind of way. Philosophy is about structuring this endeavor. So, first of all, a little bit of housekeeping. Ethics and morality are two words that basically mean the same thing. So I will be using them interchangeably. There are ways of talking about ethics and ways of constructing philosophy where these do have very different technical meanings. So I don't want to say this is the truth, but generally speaking, for all that we're doing, ethics and morality are the same thing. Also very important is that ethics, both as a noun and as a process, is not going to tell you what is right and wrong. It is a process. Ethics as a philosophical term is the kind of structure that you use to figure out what is right and wrong. But by itself, ethics will not be able to tell you what is right and wrong. That very much depends on your input. And this is because ethics fundamentally works in frameworks. These are usually axiomatic frameworks. So you set some kind of axiomatic rules. Axioms are a word for a rule that you just state, and it's true regardless of anything else. And then you use logic and inference and all kinds of other consistent philosophical tools to build from those axioms into, well, questions of right and wrong. And so the choice of framework by itself is also an ethical question, or it often is. Whether you are going to use some axioms and not others, that is a decision you have to make, and that's a decision that is firmly in the domain of meta-ethics. And so this, here we start in subdividing the field of ethics. Ethics as a whole is generally considered one of the big pillars, the four pillars of philosophy. So within ethics, we usually say there's meta-ethics, there is normative ethics, and there's applied ethics. So those are kind of the three subdivisions within ethics that all tend to go one layer deeper into the actual questions of right and wrong. So meta-ethics. Meta-ethics really deals with trying to figure out those very base questions and base assumptions within ethics itself. It looks at the tools that we choose to use in ethics and the axioms we choose and figuring out if they are good or bad. So ethics within philosophy is one of the only places that is sort of prescriptive. Usually philosophy is just this way of looking at things and not really judging anything, but obviously in ethics you have to judge stuff. That's the whole point of it. So it is very different in that regard. And we will see in the three branches of ethics that they kind of sort of overlap with other branches as well. So meta-ethics maybe is the most epistemological part of ethics. So it really goes into the methods of ethics and tries to systematize this and tries to figure out, is this a good way of doing ethics or not, and are these the right questions to ask, and that kind of stuff. And in meta-ethics, you often use epistemological frameworks to get to this kind of information and to put a good foundation onto ethics itself. So for instance, the central question of meta-ethics is what is good and what is bad? Because ultimately we want to answer whether a specific action, for instance, is good or bad, or whether a specific method will cause a good or bad consequence. But what is good and bad? Before we answer that question, we cannot do any ethics, right? And not even that, we can go one layer above on metaethics and say, how do we actually properly get to these questions of what is good and bad, or what is goodness and what is badness? And that's an epistemological question. That is something you have to answer with trying to look at the concept of goodness and badness and looking at it from multiple angles and seeing if there's some kind of consistent way to answer this. And goodness and badness are metaethical questions that are basically unanswerable from reasonable axioms. So also in metaethics, we usually choose a certain axiomatic basis to do the ethics on, which I won't go into in this video, but just suffice it to say that this whole concept of goodness and badness is widely regarded to be a social construct, so something that is not an ultimate property of the universe. It is probably not objective. It is probably something that is very, very common to people, maybe common to life in some circumstances, but definitely not an intrinsic property of the universe. It's not a law of nature. So, and it's not something that can easily be derived from laws of nature or anything like that. To get back to the epistemology video, it's largely not something that is very firmly grounded, and it's important to weigh that fact into actual ethics itself. Oh, and of course, it's very important to state here that part of metaethics is also this idea that ethical concepts are laws of nature, or are an intrinsic property of the universe. This is, for instance, the usual religious view. So the idea that morality and goodness and badness and the whole lexicon of ethics is imposed by a creator or a god or something like that. Now, needless to say, I will not be defending this position. I generally have what's called the cognitivist perception of metaethics. I won't go too much into it, but it is useful to know that even though I say that that metaethics says that it's probably a social construct, not everybody agrees. And in fact, I would say historically, the majority of people does not agree with me. This is probably also a good section to start talking about moral absolutism, moral universalism also, as well as moral nihilism and moral relativism. Especially this last term is something that is very common on the internet, and it seems like people don't really understand what it means, as is often the case, because it has a very technical meaning within philosophy. So this is a metaethical concept which deals with whether metaethics is sort of universally applicable. So a moral universalist will probably say that there is some kind of universal concept of good and bad, or at least goodness and badness, and that this can be applied to everyone and in some case everything. This is also a different metaethical question of whether just humans have morality, or whether this can be extended into the animal world, for instance, or more modernly to things like aliens. It will be very interesting to see what philosophy does once we make contact with aliens. So this is basically an open question, but there are stated positions. So the moral universalists, as I said, they think that there's some kind of concept of goodness and badness that applies to everybody, and conversely, a concept of goodness and badness that everybody can agree on, as opposed to moral relativists, who say basically my position that morality and ethics are a social construct. The value of goodness and badness, or good and bad, is something that is very dependent on like personal preferences or personal ideas, as well as, for instance, societal traditions. Memetics, for instance, is a morally relativist position, where you say that there are these social ideas that propagate through populations. It's not just moral ideas, it's also other ideas, but the moral side of it is a meta-ethical thing. Now, of course, there's also moral nihilists. This is very distinct from moral universalism and moral relativism. Because a moral nihilist will say that there is no such thing as universal goodness and badness. It's not just a social construct, it is something that cannot be evaluated. This is a very interesting position, and it's a little bit hard to understand, honestly. In this video, I will not be going into a moral nihilism. It's very important to understand that moral relativism and moral nihilism are very different things. I know that probably a lot of you are familiar with people like Jordan Peterson or any of their debunkers, or whatever, this whole ecosystem that has been created in the past few years. A Canadian professor, I think, often equates moral relativism with nihilism, and this is just false. This doesn't work that way. These are very distinct things with distinct technical meanings. And I think the best way to conceptualize the difference between moral universalism and relativism, and also nihilism to some point, is to basically say that moral universalism is very much the idea that you can algorithmically, so without any further moral or meta-ethical judgment, you can derive moral values from some set of axioms. Whereas with moral relativism, you need some form of judgment. It's a complex and non-deterministic process to get from your axioms to moral judgments on actual actions. And the latter just seems to be much more like you do most things, right? It should be pretty obvious from the videos I made so far that this is exactly the process that I use. And this is a process that things like science uses. Now, this doesn't mean that I won't change my mind in the future, let that be clear. If a better argument comes along, then of course I will change my mind. That's the whole idea of this. This is just to prepare you for the rest of this video and the rest of the future videos. This will be the framework that I will be working in to go further. If I don't say this, if I go and try to use all different frameworks and maybe make some of my own, this will be a 10,000 part video series. It's impossible to do this. We've had meta-ethics. Now let's delve into the second giant part of ethics, which is normative ethics. This is basically where we generate these frameworks, these ethical frameworks, which we can then later use to apply to real-life situations. So it's not yet applied. It's not meta-ethics. We have now established that there is such a thing as good or bad. We have established rules of logic and that kind of stuff. We have established the framework that we can construct our own ethics here. All the meta-ethics has been done. Let's now use this to generate actual ethics. I think it's best to do this by example. This is also how Wikipedia does this, and I have to say Wikipedia's entries on philosophy are just great. Especially if you're already sort of familiar with everything, it's just a great reference work. The first one is virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is this basically an ancient idea. It is also it's usually introduced as Aristotle's idea of morality, where morality is decided by basically the character of a person. So a person is intrinsically good or bad in some way. And even though this is a very, very old idea, it is exceptionally common in lay people. It is probably how most people conceive of most of their ethics. It is a common thing to hear, or it's kind of like a meme, that, well, the guy, he did commit this or that crime, but he's a good guy, so he probably shouldn't be punished too much. Or, well, it was only a misdemeanor, but I mean, the guy is a real jerk. He probably deserves to get jail time. This is virtue ethics. This is 100% virtue ethics. And I won't dwell too much on this. I disagree with virtue ethics, I don't think. Especially from a moral relativist position. I don't think there is such a thing as intrinsically good or bad people. good or evil people, I should say, in the language of ethics. It's just bullshit, basically. I don't think that people are actually good or bad intrinsically. I have to say, because most people think this way, it is a very common way of thinking, and it is probably a way you think as well. This concept of virtue ethics, it seeps into everything, including things like internet conversations. The whole concept of, for instance, somebody being right on most things and then having this one bad take or one wrong piece of data or something in an argument that completely invalidates everything, that is essentially a virtue ethics type moral judgment that you have on that person. You are disregarding a large part of their information because they were wrong on one point. Or conversely, somebody was right on something and you just disregard all the other bullshit that they say. This is, I mean, psychologically, just judging psychologically, right? This is how a lot of people fall for scams. Somebody says a couple of good things, and then the rest of it is bullshit, or the rest of it is kind of misleading, and you buy their bullshit products and you figure out, oh, damn, I've been scammed. This is, I mean, it's not quite all virtue ethics. It's also some adjacent things in psychology and just how people work psychologically. We will get into psychology, by the way, in a future video. But yeah, this is all very adjacent to virtue ethics, and it's important to understand when you're using this. It is totally fine. Again, I am not actually judging you. I'm not even judging me for thinking in these ways that I don't agree with, because I think that is just being human. We cannot stop ourselves from these automatic thoughts, but it is probably important to analyze them when you do them and maybe try improving yourself eventually. With that out of the way, let's talk about deontology. This is one of the, again, something you are probably familiar with. You might be familiar with the categorical imperative of Emmanuel Kant, and if not, I will tell you all about it. So deontology has to do with moral duty. The whole concept of deontology is that you have some kind of duty, and a duty meaning some kind of concept that you have to abide by in order for something to be good, and if you violate it, that is something that should be considered bad. So a very common formulation is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Categorical means absolute, and imperative means something you have to do. So you absolutely have to do these things. This is a duty that you cannot go without. So Immanuel Kant conceptualized these categorical imperatives as those things that logically follow. So the standard example is stealing is permissible. So if stealing were permissible, there's this concept of personal property that you can steal, but if it is permissible to steal, the personal property is violated. Therefore, you cannot logically consistently say stealing is good or permissible. Stealing has to be bad. It's categorically imperative not to steal, i.e. thou shalt not steal, right? So again, in common parlance, it is often seen as the categorical imperative. It's not one thing. It is a process, again, to construct moral duties. And these moral duties are sort of absolute. So this is, meta-ethically speaking, moral universalism-ish, but then in the normative space. Deontology, the whole thing is, deontology deals with these imperatives, these duties. Sometimes people formulate this differently. So Immanuel Kant is not the only guy doing deontology, even though he was basically the founder of the field. There's also, for instance, a super universalist idea, natural rights. So natural rights and natural duties. Where there is some kind of universal set of rights and duties that everybody has that you should act upon, and it's the duty of the philosopher to basically figure out these universal rights. By the way, there might be some baby sounds in the background, sorry for that. Then as a second very large branch of philosophy of ethics, then as a second very large branch of ethics, there is consequentialism. And consequentialism is a large umbrella term again for things that you might have heard of, like utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a thing that most economists use. So there's this concept of utility, and utilitarianism says that it is good to maximize utility. And utility is something you construct. For instance, you can say the utility of a human life is how much value they produce for the economy, right? And then a utilitarianist view of the ethics of the situation would be to maximize the amount of value that every single person generates. So a good population level decision would be a decision that for the population as a whole maximizes their turnover, profit, I don't know, or money generated. But there's also a personal thing, so a personal ethics that you can do, a personal utilitarian ethics in that frame would be you want to make as much money as possible. That maximizes utility, and therefore that is good. Now, consequentialism as an umbrella term, it has utilitarianism as one of its expressions, but there's also things like egoism, so maximizing one's own goodness, I suppose. There is things like intellectualism, which I really like, maximizing the amount of useful knowledge that somebody has. And there's things like preference utilitarianism, where you don't look at a utility function as a mathematical thing, but as the sum total of your preferences, of your axiomatic beliefs, and trying to maximize that. All of this is consequentialism, because you are attaching a value judgment to the ultimate consequence of your actions, and not necessarily of your base assumptions, and then working from there. So by now it should be pretty clear to you that not all of these frameworks can coexist, right? So this concept of natural human duties and rights, that doesn't really gel with a consequentialist view of the world. Likewise, different types of utilitarianism are mutually exclusive, or at least complex. All of this is to say, it's rare to find somebody who just has this one branch of ethics that they rigidly apply and adhere to. Often, you have to look at things from different perspectives. And even when talking about ethics, you have to consider the ethics of other stakeholders in your equation, right? So if you look at things in a utilitarian way, you cannot just say things have to be utilitarian when talking about a business. Because a business is comprised of multiple people, all of whom can have very different ideas of what is good and bad. So you probably have to consider those if you are a consequentialist, but also if you have some kind of universalist view of the world. So that goes into applied ethics. So we went through the big normative ethics frameworks. Now let's apply them, right? So applied ethics is an umbrella term for basically what we do to apply all these meta-ethical and normative ideas to practical situations. And this is a specialized field because, well, every type of situation is kind of different, and there are useful tools for each situation. So there's things like medical ethics. Medical ethics is an applied ethics field that has very specific ideas of how to evaluate what's good or bad. A lot of this is around harm reduction, but also about acceptable harm. So for instance, as a recent example, is it reasonable to just shotgun tens or hundreds of vaccine candidates on large enough populations to get statistically significant result or powerful results? if there's a chance of like a decent percentage of those people dying from your weird vaccine candidates to save, well, millions in the world, is that acceptable? Within the medical ethical framework, these are obviously questions that have malleable answers. So for instance, for the yearly flu vaccine, the threshold for what is an acceptable amount of test subjects that get ill or have a loss of quality of life or actually die is very, very low. It is surprisingly low considering how deadly the flu actually is. For the COVID vaccine, it's quite clear that as a society, we are much more willing to offer up a couple people so we can go back to work, right? And so we can go back to normal life, because pandemics have a larger overall impact than flu season. So from most perspectives, there is a reasonable argument to be made that it is good to have a larger amount of casualties in trying to find a vaccine quickly. However, a medical ethical question can be very different from a business ethical question. So, of course, there's some overlap. Most companies, most institutions in the medical field are companies, so they're businesses, so they have business ethics things as well. But this is a very specialized field. Business ethics, on the other hand, is one of the larger fields. It's surprising. I got into business ethics a couple of years ago, and it was just very surprising to me that this is the largest bit of philosophizing that goes on in the world almost. It's also full of lots of charlatans, by the way, but lots of talk about that. The reason for this is that businesses are very varied, and businesses tend to have quite a diverse range of ethical questions to think about. So in business ethics, first of all, you have to do with people, so you have to work with moral questions, but the different people, the different stakeholders in your business are very different kinds of people and very different kinds of institutions. So you have your employees, for instance. Those are generally the most human type people, the most closest to the general population. But then you have people like managers and directors, people like me, who have an outsized influence on the company, and thus we have to basically pay more attention to ethics questions because the impact of those decisions that we make affects so many more people. But then, of course, we also have to think about ethical questions towards our suppliers, for instance. I talked about this in an earlier video. A supplier, for instance, that does not get paid on time for no real reason may have financial trouble at some point, or they may have issues when somebody doesn't supply them on time, wink wink nudge nudge. All of these things, they are, of course, business decisions, they are financial decisions, they are economic decisions, but they're also ethical decisions. And of course, one of the largest stakeholders commonly conceptualized with businesses is shareholders. Shareholders also have usually an outsized influence on your business. And appeasing shareholders is a very large ethical issue. And the ethics doesn't stop at just general business ethics, larger picture stuff. Also, businesses tend to change how they need to apply ethics very quickly. Something as simple as an accident happening in the company it's an event that will spur, for instance, ethics of care being much more important to consider at that point in time and directly afterwards than in your normal operations. So most of the time, for instance, you've done your work right, you've got your first aid kit, you've got your procedures, everything, and then an accident happens. Accidents aren't supposed to happen. By the way, that is also a whole ethical thing, whether you try to prevent things or whether you try to fix them after the fact, that kind of stuff. But I mean, an accident can happen, and it is a very important ethical decision whether after the accident, well, of course, during the accident, exactly what you do, that's very important to evaluate, but then also after the accident, how do we make sure that it doesn't happen again, because the accident is a bad thing, right? That's an ethical question. So businesses tend to be a very dynamic place when ethics are concerned. And there's basically an infinite amount of things to talk about, which we will do in future videos. So I hope you like this one. We'll stop doing the real foundational philosophy from here on out and start talking more about applied things in future videos. Alright, hope you liked it. Bye bye.